While the country groaned under the corona measures, British government officials celebrated boisterously. The scandal came out, the police are also investigating Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and more penalties will be imposed. London police have now imposed further fines for a lockdown party in Downing Street on the eve of Prince Philip's funeral. The notices of £50 each were sent by email, that's what the BBC reported on Monday. The ceremony on April 16th in 2021 marked the farewell of Prime Minister Boris Johnson's Director of Communications, James Slack. Johnson was not present at this event and therefore has not yet received a penalty. However, he had to publicly apologize to Queen Elizabeth II. The Queen sat separately from family members at the funeral service for her husband on April 17th because of the corona regulations. When it became known that a party had taken place in Downing Street the night before, despite the contact restrictions in place, there was great outrage across the country. Johnson was present at several events that the police are still investigating. It is therefore not impossible that a fine will also be imposed on him. That would significantly increase the pressure on the Prime Minister. Johnson had even been asked by his Conservative Party to resign over the Partygate affair, but was saved by the war. I know it sounds ridiculous for the moment. And suddenly it becomes clear what damage the half-forgotten Brexit has caused. According to recent reports from the UK Office for Budget Responsibility, the UK is having a harder time than other countries getting back on its feet economically, for which the pandemic can no longer be blamed. British trade, the agency has said, has, compared to the recovery in global trade in recent times, not done so good, which indicates that Brexit is a factor in this uneven development. In fact, many exporters have been complaining for a long time about the problems in business with the EU caused by Johnson's hard Brexit, about delivery problems, failing orders and massive losses everywhere. The OBR estimates that the UK will have 15% less combined import and export business than it would have had it stayed in the EU, or at least in the EU single market. But it's not only in the economic sector that doubts are growing about the promise of huge profits and new national status by the Brexiteers. Since the outbreak of war in Ukraine, questions have also increased in foreign and defense policy. Ukraine marks the end of Brexit illusions, said London's Financial Times recently. Much criticism has already been triggered that the government, despite all the promises made in the 2019 election, reduced the scope of the domestic armed forces and development aid. In general, the Brexiteers try to draw attention to new Far Eastern spheres with plans for proud naval deployments away from Europe, which has hardly been mentioned lately. With war raging in Europe, London is struggling to impress the world with militant appeals and liberal arms shipments to Kiev. Despite all claims to lead the West in resistance against Russia, the political leadership in London appears to be quite isolated. Surprised by the desire for unity and the relatively swift action of the EU governments, the British have only been able to assert a limited degree of separate influence. For example, Boris Johnson was absent from early negotiation efforts with the Kremlin, and on the field of sanctions, his ministers stumbled behind. In general, there was a lack of the necessary platform and good relations in coordinating with the rest of Europe in support of Ukraine. At the last EU summit in Brussels, Johnson hoped in vain to be guest of honor at the table, and the hope for confidential talks with Joe Biden on the sidelines of the NATO summit also did not take place. After the Brexit referendum, Johnson had assured that leaving the EU in no way meant the end of close cooperation with the Europeans on foreign and defense policy. But when he implemented Brexit, he no longer cared about agreements of any kind. At the time, he was simply concerned with demonstrating national sovereignty. Commentators such as prominent columnist Robert Shrimsley believe that the need to downplay the EU and glorify the island as a global Britain has determined British politics. The Brexit mentality is the driving force behind all diplomatic thinking here, he said. This was promptly confirmed by Prime Minister Johnson when he recently provoked our dear friends in the EU with a cheeky comparison of British and Ukrainian demands for freedom. Just as the Ukrainians were now fighting for freedom from Russia, the British would have fought for their freedom from the EU at Brexit. Well, that nonsense he told enthusiastic delegates at his spring party conference in March. Old Brexit thinking is also creating new complications when it comes to taking in Ukrainian refugees. The government oscillates between the obvious helpfulness of many of its citizens and its own political instinct to keep the refugee rate as low as possible. Great Britain is the only European country that requires Ukrainians to present a valid visa at the time of arrival and threatens illegal travelers with a prison sentence of several years. And so much about the leading role of global Britain. And I'll see you in my next video. Bis gleich.